cloud, share the screen. Okay. Okay. So, Jason, can you tell, is it recording from your end? Can you see?
Yes,
Yep,
it appears
okay.
that it's recording, and my recording is also set and going well.
Okay, okay. So we're going to talk about complex PTSD and using psychedelics for the more or less treatment of this issue. And I made up a bunch of slides here to help me share some things that I think are rather important. So I'm going to start with this idea. First of all, I want to make sure that everybody knows what CPTSD, and so what that means is complex PTSD, and it becomes complex because we grow up as children. It's basically developmental trauma. So we're growing up as children and we have difficulties at home growing up. We have issues with abusive parents or neglectful parents, that kind of thing. So complex PTSD becomes complex because it's actually happening while we are developing and becoming adults. So my question or my proposal, or my putting out to everybody, is this a crappy deal? Or possibly we can use this as a path of initiation. And I know in my own history, it became a path of initiation. So I had a 20-year eating disorder that started when I was about 11 years old, went on for 20 years. By the time I came out of a denial with it, at age 28 or so, I went on to do recovery. At that time, nobody knew that it existed as a disorder, and went on to actually recover myself at a time when people didn't know that recovery was possible. I'm not going to go into a lot right here about my background because I've done it before, it's on my website. But basically a big overview of it is that during that time, I was a child of the 60s. I was playing around with LSD. I had some major experiences along those lines. But the significant thing was I had a huge awakening on the subway in New York City in my early 20s that was not drug induced. And that is what really was the focus of my commitment to not only recovery, but living a life of love. And at that point, why it's significant is I went on to look for a form of metaphysical training. So this talk is actually going to be a lot about the work that I did at that time to not only recover from the eating disorder, but then to really work on myself. And I call it a form of alchemical light work. We're going to talk more about it. Here is Ralph Metzner, who most of you know of, who died last year, significant professor at CIIS, San Francisco, and hung out with Timothy Leary and Ram Dass, but he wrote many, many books. And Ralph Metzner was actually involved in the school that I found. So in my early 20s, I was looking for a metaphysical training after that awakening. And I found this school called Actualism, which actually can go back onto the net now, and you can plug in actualism.org and you can find it. There are remnants of that school still going on, although it's not as massive as it was at the time. So I didn't really realize it, but that was an esoteric training. And I got involved with them at that time in this process of light work or Agni Yoga. So Agni Yoga, light work was what I got involved with. As you can see in the book, Maps of Consciousness, Actualism is actually a chapter in his book. And that's the last chapter in his book. And he talks significantly about that and what the school was about. It was a form of Agni Yoga, so it was a fire yoga, and we're going to talk more about that in the latter part of this presentation. So the one thing I want to say is I don't claim to be an expert. I do have a master's degree, and I went on to took everything that I learned after I recovered and I applied it, and I became a therapist. I created an eating disorder program, and I helped other women recover from their eating disorder issues. And it was actually it was an online program, very beginning stages of the internet. So that, all of that, let me see if oh yes. So the other thing I just want to say is that so there was a lot of light work. Actually, it was through the light work that I recovered. I went on to raise a family, and it was after my family left, I went down to Amazon, did some ayahuasca, which was a total reset of my operating system. That's how I would like to say it. I also have done Ibogaine, healed some birth trauma stuff through Ibogaine and Iboga. Significantly, about a couple of years, a little over a couple of years ago, is when I really got involved more heavily in this work. And that was after I did an MDMA experience and went on to do some more and got into working with mushrooms myself, in which very, very difficult for me, actually. I can talk more about that later, but the mushroom work has been definitely a path of shadow work, which we're also going to talk more about later. So that's the background, and my expertise comes from my experience, essentially. And I've always done that. I've always applied my own healing to what I've learned in terms of healing, and I've taken it and I've shared it with others. That's my path. I know that that's not everybody's path, but that is my path. So here, when I first realized that I wanted to work with eating disorder, what I discovered was that when I was working with women, I noticed that they weren't not connected to their bodies. And so I thought, well, I don't know what I'm going to do here, because I know that they're not going to know when they're hungry and when they're full if they're not connected to their body. So I found a training called Integrative Body Psychotherapy. And it was integrative body psychotherapy that was a 3-year in-depth training in embodiment work, in trauma embodiment work. It had to do with relational work, so boundaries and relationship in the body. It was a very deep training, and they basically shared their template or their map, and I've been using it ever since. So this is essentially it, and I'm not going to go, this is a whole lecture in and of itself, and I'm not going to do that today because I want to put it in context. But what's important to know is that here in the center here is this little self. It's actually not so little in this diagram. It's much bigger than mine was at the time. But this little self is, as we're growing up as children and we become wounded, we lose connection with the self. So that's the true self, the essence self. And instead, what happens is in order to protect ourselves from the 2 forms of trauma that there is, abandonment and invasion, so there's only 2 forms of trauma in that way, we develop a set of false selves or ego defense patterns that we use to keep ourselves safe so that we don't feel the pain of this abandonment and invasion or abuse. And what's interesting about this model is that the type of false self or ego defense that we develop has a lot to do with where we're weighted in terms of whether the trauma was more focused on the abandonment side or on the invasion side. So on the abandonment side, if you can think about it, it's like if we're not reflected, if we're not seen, then we really don't have a sense of who we are. And instead of experiencing ourselves, what happens is the self sort of disappears and we become empty, and it feels like we don't matter or we don't exist. And when that happens, then what happens as we grow up, that defense pattern is to hold on or try to grab onto others. And those others can be not only just people, but also we might grab onto success, or we may grab onto money, or we may grab onto addictions. So this whole defense mechanism is become centered around this never enough, like we can't get enough because we're trying to fill an emptiness that's inside. And of course, we cannot never do that. So that grasping for something outside of ourselves can never fill this emptiness inside, because the emptiness inside is the own lack of our connection with ourselves, obviously. So there's nothing outside that's going to be able to fill it. But because of this sense of I need something to feel safe, and the only thing I know to look for is that thing out there, I will grab for that thing to feel safe. And that's the key piece here. I'm going to grab outside myself to feel safe. When there's been invasion, on the other hand, then what's going to happen is that I'm going to feel powerless inside. I'm going to be scared. I'm going to put up walls around me. I'm going to become hypervigilant. And so what happens is we begin to form these rigid boundaries to keep the pain away, but we also keep others away. And we tend to go towards more of being alone or feeling safe when we're alone. So when we have more invasion, then we'll feel safer when we're alone, okay? So an interesting thing begins to happen, though, that is rather significant, is that when we're weighted equally, abandoned and invaded, what happens is we don't have safety anywhere. So what happens is we go out. If we're with people, we won't feel safe because we have an equal amount of invasion. And if we go inside ourselves and we're alone, we don't feel safe because we have an equal amount of wanting to pull outward. So there's no safety anywhere in the world. And then what happens is we rise up above, or we rise up out of our body. And that's basically called dissociation. But really in our culture, and I feel like this is what's really important, we need to honor that we have a dissociated culture and that we function a lot from our mind. So the normalized dissociation of our culture is what I have called the mentalizer. So we're living conceptually from our mind, and that's because it doesn't feel safe to be in our body. The work to come out of this is to become more embodied and to learn how to start to find those safety resources internally. Okay, so that is the model. This is the model for the first model I learned for basically dealing with complex PTSD and working with the traumatized self on a psychological level. What's really interesting, though, is this. Okay, so what is this? And I was always curious about that in the early stages of my recovery work and the early stages of my training. I was wondering, what is this self? And this is the key piece that we really want to look at here today. When we're functioning from out here, this self is what we think of as normal, and what we think of that other people have that we don't seem to have, that if we could figure out how to become a normal, well-adjusted human being, we would do it. And essentially, then we would learn that we could just safely give up all of the defense mechanisms, which, by the way, another word that we're going to use to call these false selves is the ego. It's the ego defenses. In internal family systems, this would be called more the protectors. So they're protecting these more wounded parts inside, which in internal family systems is the exiles. So this is all important as we start looking at what we're going to be doing with our psychedelic work. So what is this? Well, from the standpoint of the traumatized self, this is just a normal self, and somehow we can't reach it, right? Okay. Notice that I wrote something down here on purpose. This is not the mystery. And this is what we start to find as we continue to do our healing work. And especially if we start looking for healing in the area of psychedelic work. We want to look at this chart right here. And what we see, here's our self, this mysterious self that's inside and somehow we can't connect with. This self exists in the now. So it exists as now awareness. Well, something is very interesting here. If you look at this line is the line of the ego. Now, the ego only exists in the past. So it doesn't exist in the self. So we cannot get to the self through the ego. You'll also notice that when I have here ego as savage DMN, which we're going to understand in the next slide, that was coined by Sarah Payton. This is very significant for all of us who are working with trauma and with psychedelics. So this will show us that the whole conglomerate of being, which is represented by this whole slide, is a great mystery. And there's the part above, or the part over here, which is represented by this upper half of the page, is our awareness. It's like as we become more recovered, or as we start to heal more, we have more awareness of who we actually are, so that the self starts to grow. But at the same time, this stuff in the bottom is the unaware. This is all the unaware, unconscious area that we're not yet in touch with. And this, very interestingly enough, when I was first creating this slide, I was thinking, oh, well, obviously, if awareness gets bigger, then unawareness is going to get smaller. But actually, what actually happens is the unawareness gets bigger. So our awareness gets expanded, and so does unawareness. And this part over here, what we're calling, is the mystery. So actually, as we begin to step out of this ego place, which is living in the past, we actually have to begin stepping into the unknown and into the great mystery. So Sarah Payton wrote a book called Your Resonant Self. And if you haven't read this, I highly recommend this. And she's the one that, at least I think, coined the term savage DMN, because I haven't heard it before. And what that means is that the default mode network, so the default mode network is actually the network that holds the ego. So here's what she's basically telling us, that when traumatized people default, they will automatically default to negative thinking, self-blame, and abuse, rather than to neutrality. So this is very significant. So somebody who doesn't have complex PTSD, you kind of wonder, how come they seem to be okay and they seem to function okay in the world? And that's because they have a default mode that's not traumatized, that's not negative. But traumatized people do. So the thing about the DMN is that whenever conscious activity stops, the DMN takes over. The negative self-abuse and the blame will start up. So this is a very important correlation. It's the more conscious and focused our mind, the more we focus our mind intentionally on whatever it is, the more control we have over the savage DMN. And the more emotional pain a person has survived, the more likely it is for the DMN to be toxic. Okay. So here we have a problem. The traumatized default mode network is a problem, because we can't just walk around in general existence and feel okay about ourselves. However, there's a saving grace. And the saving grace is what she calls the dorsal attention network. We're just going to call it DAN from now on. But DAN is what we can utilize within the brain to break the spell of the default mode. And that happens whenever we're focusing our attention on something new. So we can be focusing our attention on a video game, or we can be focusing our attention on a creative project or a focused meditation. We can certainly be focusing our attention on an addiction or a distraction. That works too. And so mostly a lot of addiction is connected to the fact that we're trying to get away from our default mode. And we're doing it by focusing our attention on something else that then becomes addictive. So if we look at this chart, we have to ask ourselves, where does our awareness go? If it's not going anywhere, we're suffering because of our default mode. When we bring Dan on board, then we have some options. So those of us stuck in distractions, entertainment, and addiction, that's where our awareness is going. That's our Dan, and it's going there for a reason, because it's trying to avoid the suffering of the DMN. However, we have another option, and that is the intention to heal. That's where choice and will come in. So the point being is that we must choose to focus our awareness on healing, not on the DMN or addiction. It's a choice that we have to make if we wish to grow beyond our suffering. And that begins, so this healing begins with getting present, because remember, the default mode is not present. So the default mode is repeating the past over and over again. Okay, so what is healing? So this is another piece of the puzzle. So if we were, imagine we were fish in the ocean, right? And we're swimming in the ocean, and the ocean is our atmosphere, or I guess as human beings, then air, and the air we breathe is our atmosphere. We were born and raised into an allopathic atmosphere. So we're born and raised into an atmosphere of a Western medical model, which is saying that in order to heal, what we need to do is treat the symptoms. But I think most of us are pretty aware, if we're ending up on this call, that that's not really working. We have depression, we might take an antidepressant. We have anxiety, we might take an anti-anxiety pill. So what we're doing is we're really trying to feel better. It's very similar in some ways to really the use of addiction and distraction, actually. So there's just a sense of we need to get out of our suffering. Now, I find it very interesting that the psychological model also is born in an atmosphere of allopathic Western thinking. So in allopathic Western thinking, we're also treating trauma as if there is a cause and effect, as if there is it is a symptom. So our trauma symptoms are, again, a symptom of something that happened in the past. And while that may be true, I don't think that's the whole picture. So what puts us kind of in a box, and it kind of puts us in this sort of sense of, okay, if I can just get this event that happened when I was a kid, or maybe it was a rape when I was 15, or maybe it was my alcoholic dad, or whatever it was, and if I could just get a handle on that, then all of my symptoms are going to go away. And the whole idea of both of these ways of dealing with things is that then we become more normal, or we become more functional. And that's what we want to be in order to function well in society. So we are wanting to become more normal. Remember from that map over here, from this standpoint, this is what we think the self is. If I could only just get here and be more normal and be more functioning like other people, right? So that's where we're headed there. However, healing is a very different thing. And healing begins when we begin to recognize that there is something vastly unknowable that we have no idea what that is. Healing begins to happen when we step out of the box of the whole DMN structure, of the whole ego structure, and we start stepping out. And as we start stepping out, we find out that there's a whole unknown out there, that there's a mystery out there. And so we begin to invite the mystery in the vehicle of our body, and we begin to invite the mystery, we begin to step out into the mystery and become curious about who we might become if we didn't have this issue. We don't know now who we are, actually. We don't know who we are becoming. And this is then the whole other area that I feel like in our Western allopathic model, we don't allow and don't give enough attention to. Is the whole idea that we're living a mystery. So living a mystery, and that's where the healing starts to happen. And it begins by moving out of being stuck in the past to becoming more present in the mystery of the now. And from that place, then we begin to move into more creativity in our thinking and into our expression. The whole reframe of I begins to change. So we can look at this chart here and we could just see there are many levels of I. So we started with the ego, which was the defended self. It's survival and safety oriented. And a lot of us, when we start there, we actually have a sense that there's something else and greater and better, and we might call it the higher self or our higher power, but it's still a sense that we're functioning in this encapsulated, separated self, and that we can reach into something higher. And it's an interesting word because higher implies that we're lower. And in fact, the true self is neither. It's neither ego or higher, but we don't know that yet. So we reach out to a higher. And then, well, as we begin to heal, we might embrace something that becomes more embodied in the present. So that's where we're headed. We're headed into more presence. And then from there, and this is not necessarily linear, but we begin to embrace, instead of an ego self, we have an eco self, or there's a green self, or a primal self, or a wild self. So that's part of the mystery that we start to uncover. And then we might move more into ancestral sense of self or a collective sense of self. And then we move even deeper down in and we become connected with an essential self, which has certain specific qualities of wisdom and joy and compassion and peace and humor and strength and grief. And those are all the essential aspects of self. We may have a sense of being archetypal, or we may connect with mythological aspects of ourselves. And certainly with psychedelic use, we become more aware of the transcendent or the cosmic. I have a problem with this. I think that there's a place here for this. I was certainly here myself, and I was out of my body, but that's not sustainable. And in fact, for people with complex PTSD, it's not safe either, because if we're not in our body, we can't sense danger, really. So it's not a great place to hang out for any length of time. So ideally, we get to the place where we're able to embrace a multidimensional sense of self, of unknowable and infinitely knowable. Okay. So from here, I have an opinion. And in my opinion, when we're working with psychedelics, psychedelics need to be used as part of a comprehensive spiritual, creative, energetic, and psychological program of healing. They're not just to be used as a pharmaceutical, thinking that we can fix our symptoms. And again, that's just coming from the place that we're all born into, in the ocean that we swim in, that we're born into this idea of allopathic, that we want to fix our symptoms and we want to feel better. And it's also not black and white, because I certainly have worked with people who have come with that in mind and are microdosing, for example, to replace their pharmaceuticals, or they're just wanting, and somehow some people get the idea that one journey is going to do it and they're going to fix everything, or fix the depression. And I have certainly worked with people who I've seen have had very major miraculous experiences from one high dose session. I have seen that happen, but that's not usual and it's not common. There's usually layers of stuff that has to happen, and unless these other pieces are being a part of the whole picture, then we kind of can get stuck. We can get stuck. And there can be a great disillusionment that happens, actually. So let's look at this is my model. So my model of working is this. It's three-pronged. And in the center, you'll see there's getting present. And when we're present, then we have access through higher connection to source for creative thinking. And we also have more of embodied experience of self through our bodies for a creative expression. But the key pieces of this are these three legs, and they're not easily dividable, they're overlapping. So again, if we go back to my training, so when I was healing, the main work I found was the light work. So light work, I spent 15 years in the process of actually working on purifying my body, my psyche, my psyche. And I was being given tools for actually connecting with higher source energy from above, bringing it down through the crown chakra, down through the chakras, through the central vertical axis, releasing it down into the earth, releasing it down through my cells and through my body. And this kind of work was actually a work of a very, very focused work of purification. So light comes in to the denser areas and purifies. And as we're doing that, we're learning how to work with energy. The other prong would be alchemy. So alchemy is similar to light work, except that it has more of an active nature, and that we actually using our mind to transmute or to shift energy. So in the case of light work, there's an opening or receiving of the light that's coming in. But with alchemy, there's a focusing of light. There's a way that we use our mind to focus our energy in a way that actually learns how to work with the density of matter to shift it into a higher vibration. So this is all about, again, turning lead into gold, but metaphorically. So what we're doing is we're turning the lead of the density of the physicality of us, or the density of darker feeling states of anger, of grief, of helplessness or despair. So that's where we're working. We're bringing the light in, and we're actually using our tools to learn how to circulate the energy so we can transmute those heavier, denser aspects of our psyche into something that's more aligned with our soul or our spirit. And then the third leg, which is the psychological, which is what we've been talking about. But the psychological, the way I see it, is really to be used to train the body, the vehicle, our physical vehicle, to learn how to hold the light that's coming in and learn how to work with energy to transmute energy. So the psychological is only one part of a three-pronged process. And it's a part that I feel is greatly, this three-pronged process is greatly missed in most of the work that's happening today. So here we have a little box, which I was going to put a drawing in, and I never got to do it. So thank you, little box. And here is the way it goes. So it goes like this. As we're working our psychological preparation, we're also working our light and opening ourselves, our crown chakra, working our chakra system, learning how to let light in, energy, purifying. As we do that, whenever we bring more light into the system, because we live in a dual universe, then what happens is we access more shadow, or we're able to access more shadow. So we have to go back into the unconscious to bring up more stuff that needs work. So in case of trauma, that's going to be maybe implicit memories, maybe events that happened that were really dark and scary when we were little and we couldn't handle. So that's where we're going back into our exiles, and we're going back on a psychological level to all those memories that we were repressed, that we couldn't have access to. But it's much bigger than that. So shadow work is bigger than that. As we actually allow more light to come in, then we have our shadow work begins to expand. And now we're not just working with our own memories, but we're working ancestrally, and then we're working collectively, and then we're working cosmically. So there's a whole dance that's going on. And then we can learn how to transmute that energy. And as we transmute it, we feel like we have more mastery over ourselves. We have more mastery over our universe. We can bring more light in, and it continues to go round and round and round like that. So I made a few slides here. I don't need to go into everything, but basically most of us know what the psychological work is. Want to be sure that we're covering the nervous system. So this is more of the latest wonderful findings of the work of somatic relational work with the nervous system, including the polyvagal theory. So we're needing to learn how to regulate and co-regulate our nervous system, which is, again, a whole other training. But we're learning how to nurture ourselves, how to become autonomous. We're learning how to regulate our emotional expression, how to not be too overwhelmed, how to take care of ourselves. We're learning how to focus our mind. Some of us have very scattered minds, and we actually have to learn how to focus our minds. We need to learn to focus on intention. We need to learn how when we go into very negative states of mind, that we can recognize that we're doing that and shift that and begin to think more positively about things. We're learning how to disidentify with aspects of ourself, like the critic, which Sarah Payton talks about so beautifully, that the DMN is a severe inner critic for those of us with trauma. So we begin to learn how to recognize that that's a voice in our head. That's not who we are. So these are all the things that are happening on the level of the psychological. When we cut to light work, it's another story. So what we're talking about here is the pain body. And what we're talking about is shifting the pain body to a light body. And it's the art of purification. So for example, we're still maybe working on the level of the mind, right? Mind mastery, but it's with a different slant. It's a different intent. It's not just to focus the mind from something negative to something positive, but it's understanding that when we think negative thoughts, we're actually causing negative things to occur, that there is a correlation between the thoughts in our mind and what's happening outside of us. So mind mastery becomes aware of the universal law of energy follows thought. And we start learning that we need to be aware of our energy and where it's going, not only in the mind, but also on these other levels. And I'm going to mention them because they're all important. So we need to learn that our lifestyle is crucial. So we cannot bring more light and bring the light of our soul into a body that is filled with sugar and alcohol and doesn't exercise. So we need good, solid nutrition. We need to learn how to take care of our physical bodies so that the light can come in and be held. We need to learn that we have boundaries, that we need to learn how to protect our boundaries. So we need to know that when other people are draining our energy, that they're not a good person to be around. So that's the kind of thing we're talking about in lifestyle. Releasing energy that is not ours. So this is crucial. So we were raised in an environment that was probably negative, and we took on a lot of people's energies because as babies, we're just sponge, we're soaking it all in. Now we're left with a lot of energy inside, and we need to begin separating what's mine, what's theirs. The same thing, especially if we're empathic. We need to learn how to recognize this despair that I feel. Is this my despair? Is this my colleagues' despair or my neighbor's despair or the collective's despair? So we're releasing energy that's not ours because it's not ours to process. We're also learning how to transmute those denser energies that are ours and take them into a higher vibration, which is again the art of alchemy. And once we get enough light and we're able to manage light in our body system, then we can start the soul begin to start sending itself back in, so that the soul, the light of the soul, it doesn't really hang around, doesn't stay in if there's not an atmosphere that it's safe to stay in. So that's where soul retrieval comes in. With its only soul retrieval only works once we got more managed, we're able to manage our energy better. Okay, so shadow work's the other side of the light work. It's the same idea, but as we're doing this light work, it's like light work is you're taking a flashlight and you're going down into your basement, right? And before you brought your flashlight in it, you just thought it was a basement, you know, and the lights were off and you weren't aware of very much stuff down there. But once you bring that flashlight down there, you can see all the cobwebs. And now you can see the spider webs and the cobwebs and the dust particles and all of that. So that's what the shadow work is. Now we have more light. We can bring the light down into the basement of our psyche, and we begin to find out what's in there under our projections and our judgment. And that again is a whole other course, but I just wanted to give you the idea of what we're doing here. Another area of shadow work would be what we call the dark night of the soul. So I was aware that some of my clients were not aware of this. The dark night of soul is a spiritual stage, and it is a collapse of what's false or a collapse of what's not meaningful. It's like a collapse of the ego. We may be functioning in a certain way, we may even be successful, and then something happens and all of a sudden the rug gets pulled out from under us, kind of like what the collective is going through right now. So we get the things that are unimportant or not meaningful get pulled out from us, and we fall down into this dark night or this collapse. And that's a very, very important stage, and we have to go through that stage as we begin to nurture the true self. Another way to look at shadow work is that sometimes we have to intentionally decide to discover who I really am. And that's when we're actually making an intention to descend into soul. And that's a little bit different than being thrust into soul, but the sense of being, I'm going to choose my descent into soul, which means I'm going to actually choose to let go of who I think I am as an ego self and actually go deep dive in to find out who I truly am. And that's shadow work. Another aspect of shadow work is separating ourselves from the trance, personal and collective. I'm going to go into that in a moment. And then also embracing the mystery, which is embracing the mystery is a huge part of the shadow work, or what goes on in the dark areas of our world. So James Gesso wrote a book called Decomposing the Shadow. I'm sure many of you have heard of them, but if you have not read this book, I would highly suggest it as well. He spent about a year doing psilocybin work on himself, especially for facing his own shadow work. And he came up with this as a beautiful quote. Once these experiences become dark, so I'm sure many of us on here have experienced what we might call challenging or dark journeys. When we decide to go into those journeys on purpose, so he says, once these experiences become dark, we may be forced to face an even deeper darkness each time we re-enter the psilocybin space. When recognizing this potential and still choosing to work with the mushroom, this practice can become the experiential point of reference by which we explore and understand the deep courage residing within us. I think this is beautiful. It's a beautiful discourse on using mushrooms to work with shadow, those of you interested in that. And alchemy, and I'm not going to go into all of this, but I've given you the idea. Essentially, we're transmuting that density into higher vibration. I'm not going to go into all of this right now, because I do want to spend a little time with this. And I think this is very important for those of us who are playing around with psychedelics for our healing journeys, and you know, going into shadow work. And I think what we need to be aware of is that there are actually 3 types of darkness. Because in our psychedelic work, we can definitely go up to the heavens and we experience all great cosmic light and all of that stuff, that wonderful stuff. But just as easily, we can go down into the opposite, into the dark. And I want to define the differences of what we're talking about when we talk about dark. There's actually a 4th one on the next slide, but we're going to keep that separate. So these are 3 types of darkness. The first one is shadow or unconscious, and that's just what we've been talking about, taking that flashlight down into our basement, looking at some of the hidden parts and underneath what the ego thinks is okay. So an example would be, I had a very, I'm not talking about myself personally, but one might have had a rageful dad, And I formed an ego around being a very nice person and a very lovely, compassionate person. But underneath that, I have a lot of rage and anger that I've never let myself know, because if I let myself know that I was rageful and hateful, it would be like I was just being like my dad, and that wouldn't be okay. So that's what we're talking about in terms of shadow or unconscious work. So the symbols for that would be moon, caves, under the ocean, but we're looking for the stuff that's that we're unaware of. It's unconscious. So we use the light to reveal, and then once we can reveal that, then we can work with it. We can actually begin to use our alchemy to transmute it. So that's one kind. That's more or less the personal kind that we're working with. But at some point, what happens is we also become aware of the trance. And the trance of the unconscious conditioning is basically the trance of the culture. And I'm sure all cultures have their trance, and our culture has its trance. And so when we're looking at the trance of the culture, we're looking at things like gender issues, we're looking at things like money issues, we're looking at things like what we're doing to the planet, we're looking at things like greed and power over people and things. So we're looking at where we have personally bought into the collective conditioning. And that gets a little bit gnarly because it's pretty hard. We're wired into the trance. So we have an unconscious conditioning to align with the values of our trance. And so we have to wake up quite a bit. And so the light is used as we bring that awareness into waking up and untangling ourselves from the trance. And psychedelics are one of the best ways to do that. It's very, very difficult. Of course, other people speaking out and talking about things can activate that in us, and we start to look at oh yeah, I'm doing that too, that kind of thing. So that's the second kind of darkness. But the third darkness that I want to mention that I don't hear very many people talking about is what we're going to call demonic. And that darkness has an agenda, and it is intentionally concerned about blocking the light. So its agenda is to block the light, is to block our true power, our true self, our ability to step into who we truly are. We would call it like dark force, or Darth Vader would be an example of the demonic. And the use of the light is then to extract it. So we're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. We want to go into this a little bit more because we need to know about this. I feel like it's really, really important when we're working with psychedelics and we're working with complex PTSD to understand that this does exist and it's in there. And actually, I think I will just jump to this slide over here because we're talking about that now. I didn't always, but I do believe that the demonic is real. I do believe that there is such a thing as demons. I believe that there is evil. Just as there are angels, I do believe that there is evil out in the world. And for that reason, when we're working, so one thing we need to understand about this, so we're talking about energy here, energy as it comes manifest into the human form. And until we're able to see it, it's hidden from view. It's one of those shadow pieces that we don't see until we're prepared enough and we're readied enough to have enough light or to have enough psychological savvy to be able to deal with what we might see. So it's hidden from view on purpose. It's hidden from view on purpose. And it becomes very gnarly when we begin to be opened up to see this, as I have recently been. But once we see it, then a lot of things begin to change. And one of the things I want to say that I think is very important when we're dealing with trauma, especially from childhood, is that when we are children, we're babies, when we're helpless and we're hopeless, helpless and powerless, And we were raised in a dark environment. So example would be, alcoholic family, or ritual abuse, sexual abuse, that kind of thing. But things happen. So things happen before we're able to deal with them. And one of the things that happens is that dark things happen. And what we do is we actually end up leaving our body. And when we leave our body, that's what I was talking about in terms of not being safe. So when we leave our body, that means there's nobody occupying our body. Like our soul might have gone somewhere, but there's nobody occupying it. So what happens is something else comes in. So if you leave your body, who's going to occupy it? And there are many different kinds of energies that would be more than happy, to have a host. And so unless we begin to recognize that this is a real thing that can happen, especially when we're traumatized when we're little, but any trauma at any point when we leave our body, we're leaving a vehicle open for something else to come in. And same thing with psychedelics. So personally, I would never do a journey without protection. I want to be sure that I've called on all of my life protectors. I want to make sure that I'm encased in a very protective environment before I would engage in a psychedelic journey. So this is a part of what happens with shamanic journey, and any of us that are working with shamans, that's already part of the process that's involved in it, is the protection that we're put in a bubble of protection. But if we're doing it on our own, we might not be aware that this is what may happen, that this is out there. And so we're opening ourselves up to things and forces that are out of our control. Okay, so that's, I want everybody to be aware of that and be sure that you know how to protect yourself adequately. The third area of darkness is, as I mentioned before, the mystery. So this is the beauty of the darkness. This is the beauty of the place. Many of us are scared of it. The ego is terrified of the unknown. It doesn't want the mystery. It has all sorts of ideas about what that means. We're terrified to step into the mystery. That's why journeys can be very scary for people, and that's why guides are good. So somebody hold your hand as you're going into the mystery. So just be aware that the mystery is another form of darkness, and that we want to really receive. Beautiful. And it's that stepping out into the unknown and learning how to navigate it. It's like, that's one of the psychological skills. So one of the psychological skills is, how do I navigate the unknown? I need to learn how to do that. We're not born knowing how to do that. The ego is too much in control. So that's a skill we want to learn how to do. Okay. I want to give an example. When I was talking about earlier, and we're just about almost done. Thank you for hanging out here. When I was talking about the allopathic or pharmaceutical perspective on things. So let's just take a look at depression, for example. So these are just some ideas I threw out. Other people could add other ideas. But if we're coming at it from the pharmaceutical or biochemical, as depression as a biochemical imbalance, then that's great. We can use pharmaceuticals. We can go for microdosing, or we can use the sun lamp and that kind of thing, and we can get relief. And that can work. That can be really helpful in some cases for a certain amount of time. However, let's consider some of the other ideas, what depression might be about. So depression in terms of energy in the nervous system, for example, might be a collapse of the nervous system. So in somatic work, it's a collapsing, this nervous system shutting down. It's where, when we were growing up as children, it's just not okay to be happy. It's not okay to feel alive. So we depress our energy, we depress our system. And that's depression. So not only do we depress our aliveness and our happiness, but we also not allowed to experience our rage and our grief. So that becomes depression instead. So let's take number 3. Let's say we have what I was just talking about. Let's say depression could be an energy takeover, as in a dark force came in and into our lives at some point in our life, and we're walking around with some kind of dark energy that's not even ours, and it shows up as depression. So there's another example. Or what about ancestral patterns in the DNA that need to be cleared or healed for a whole lineage and the whole collective of humanity, or whatever it is? That's another option for looking at what depression might be. Or blocked meridians in the chakra system. Another real good reason for suffering with depression might be an inability of a person to allow themselves to receive the gifts, or the golden shadow it's called. It's to receive the gifts and their gifts of their own soul capacities. The brilliant genius that they came here to share with the world. That might not be okay. So then we may need to depress ourselves around that because that doesn't feel safe. So what happens if we view our depression as an allopathic need, as something's off biochemically, and all we do is we focus here? This is my concern, and I don't want anybody to get me wrong. This is not a black and white thing. This can be really helpful at certain periods of time, and I certainly have done my share as well of this, and we need to do it, and it's okay to do it. And sometimes engaging in this can even bring us into some of these other areas. But what I want us to be aware of is, by automatically going towards thinking that we're going to fix the depression easily, simply with either a microdose or using, or a high dose session for that matter, and using it as in a pharmaceutical way, that what we're doing is we're giving ourselves a huge disservice, because we're not allowing ourselves to really begin to explore some of these other avenues and what they are about, and what our soul is calling to us and wants us to know about. So this is just something to think about. You know, that if you're past the ego, DMN doesn't determine your future. If you're not who you think you are, like, who are you going to emerge? This is the big question. It's like, as I step into this work of healing and my ego starts to collapse, it doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to end up normal and functional. In fact, what mostly happens is we go through ego collapse, is that we experience dark nights. We feel like our life is crumbling. We actually have immersion into something that is difficult for a number of years even. So to go into it with a naivete that we're just going to experience some psychedelics and feel better at the end is very a dangerous viewpoint. Okay. My prep list, I'm not going to read everything, but basically on my prep list, I'm trying to cover as much of what I just shared with you as possible, so that when I am working with somebody, preparing them for their journey, this is what I'm looking at. Their safety resources, their somatic grounding, the trauma work. I'm looking at their connection to nature. Is that in place in their life? A creative expression, movement, sound, art, community with others, not just human others, with nature others, with the whole others of life, centering, meditation practice, yoga, movement, qigong, energy work. Light work is just one form, actually. I want to say like sound healing is another, but any form of vibrational healing. Cultivating silence, working with dreams, learning how to disidentify with the inner critic, because I've seen this a lot in with people's experiences on journeys, that people will, the inner critic will go away. It'll just say, goodbye, I'm out of here for now, because you know you're messing up your DMN, and that's where the critic lives. So, but that doesn't stay that way. I haven't yet seen that the inner critic doesn't come back. So until we learn how to identify who we are as separate from this inner critic, from that savage DMN, we're not going to be able to sustain our journey work. One other thing I'll share, and then I think we'll call it an end, and that is just, this is an awareness map that I use so that when people go into journeys, that they have a way of referencing a lot of different areas of being. So a lot of times people get stuck in the story of their narrative of what's going on. And so we want to be able to expand that awareness out. And so to our somatic sensation, our movement, micro and macro, feeling states, images, insights, breath work, sound, all of that is part of the journey experience. And I have some examples here that if people are interested, we can, after, I think I'd rather open it up now. We're just about at an hour. I got that all in. If you want to be on my, I do community events, I do healing events, and I do workshops. I've begun inviting people into preparation workshops and integration workshops. So I have a lot of things going on. If you want to be on my email list, you could just go into my website on the home page and sign up for the psychedelic worksheets. That will get you on my email list. I think that was, yep. And I would like to reference a bunch of books as well. So some of them I mentioned: Maps of Consciousness by Ralph Metzner, Decomposing the Shadow, Your Resonant Self. Some other really good ones are Dark Night of the Soul by Gerald May, who's a psychiatrist. Complex PTSD by Jeff Walker is amazing on this topic. And books that talk to all of Joanna Macy's, Reclaiming Your Wild Soul by Mary Reynolds Thompson, Reconnecting with Nature by Michael Cohen, amazing man. He's in his 90s now. He's amazing, did amazing work with people with nature. So at that point, I'm going to stop our share, and we're going to open this up for Q&A, and then those of you who want to stay and go into groups may. Okay, and we're going to stop the recording.